This story begins in a world mired in irrationality where two boys meet in a sword duel. After being defeated, the boy with black hair asks his opponent if he's telling him that it wasn't even necessary for him to fight against him on the first place. The blonde boy admits that he is the only one who still dares to fight him in the entire academy, but has always ended up being the loser anyway. The blonde guy, arrogantly, says that he has improved since his last meeting considering that on that training was easier for him to win. These comments makes the other guy upset, so he takes his wooden sword and attacks him again, but as expected, he would end up losing again. This black-haired boy is our protagonist, who is called Leon, and his opponent, the blonde boy, is called Leon as well. 3 years passed since our protagonist was transferred to this academy. He has pushed himself to his limit from the beginning, and still never managed to defeat his opponent, Leon. He explains that even though their names are written in the same way, they were completely different. Leon was like the protagonist of a novel because of his appearance and personality that seemed taken from a fairy tale. Our protagonist doesn't understand what he's doing in his class of commoners instead of being in the class of nobles. After the battle, the blonde approaches our protagonist to help him, but this one rejects it. Then a girl comes, we will call her Julia, who's very similar to Leon. She says that he knew that they have fought in a duel of swords again and asks why he is so insistent with his fight when he knows he cannot win. She worries about him when she realizes that he was injured in his wrist. Wanting to help him, she says she will disinfect. Leon refuses, asking not to disturb him. Changing the scenery. Is now night and our protagonist is training when his thoughts disturbs him. He wonders what would happen if he was blonde. Had the support of his family or even a teacher of the same level of Leon, something would have changed. He's frustrated because even with his effort alone he cannot overcome all the high walls of difficulties of such an irrational world. Very depressed, he feels that he has lost those 3 years and questions whether he should still continue practicing that night, if it was worth it to keep trying so hard. He scrams to heaven and the goddess asking what's the meaning of all his effort. While he tells himself it would be impossible for them to respond to this call, he lowers his gaze and notices there's a light in the sky. Once he turns around, he realizes, very scared, that there was a huge ball of light coming towards him. While he's on that situation, Julia is asking, at Leon's party, about our protagonist, and Leon seems not to know where he is, so she immediately leaves to look for him, leaving Leon planted. Then his butler reveals to us that he is actually part of royalty but seeks to hide his identity from everyone because he feels he doesn't have the right to that title. We're revealed that there's a prophecy, which was passed by the imperial family, that indicates once Leon comes of age, the current mandate of the emperor will come to an end because all citizens will witness the great rise of the former sacred King Roderick, which his family hopes will be Leon. He thinks that his butler has high expectations on him, but what Leon really wants next year in the tests is to realize if that prophecy is true or not. And if it is, he wants Julia, who has a special talent and already learning magic of 4th level, and our protagonist, who is a man of effort and has a stronger mentality than anyone, to be by his side. We are told that the prophecy says that to a man named Leon, once he reaches adulthood, a sword will descend from heaven, and with that he will completely destroy the evil of the world. Back with our protagonist, we see that in front of him fell a sword from the sky. Very surprised, he doesn't understand what that sword, that has fallen from heaven, means. And then he hears a voice ordering him to rise. Looking for where he is hearing the voice, he hears it again. The voice is asking if the one who has awakened it is not in front of the sword. Our protagonist, taking into account all the details, wonders if what was in front of him could be the sacred sword. The sword confirms his doubt and tells him that this has been the one who called it, and he wonders if he has actually done it. The sword starts saying that the way the world thinks is terribly unfair, and that people who have everything have more and more, and those who have nothing have less and less, so the opportunity must be given to those who strive to burn their own life to death. In short words, those who effort the most deserve to be at the top. Then it asks our protagonist if he believes that he deserves power after all his effort after his dispute with the goddess for absurd fate, to what he answers, full of vigor, that of course he deserves it. Then the sword says that he has now the opportunity to take his power and prove his words. He knows what it means to be the wielder of this sword, but he also knows that in that way, he could change the injustice of his harsh reality. But feeling he's not worthy of this sword, he decides to leave. Seeing this, the sword tells him that he is a brave man who has demonstrated his integrity, and that with its own will, must be its bearer. To this the protagonist bluntly takes it with his hands, and this sword is presented as Elst, the alter ego of the old King Rodrigo, the guiding sword of the light of this age. After the protagonist experienced a strange dream in which the sword had a strange conversation with this blonde man, he wonders if what he saw was a dream, but the sword tells him that it was not. So what he heard was real, that even if he possesses it he will not become strong overnight, but that he will face harsh adversity throughout his life to become a being of great civilization. He would have to leave the woman he loves, his trusted friend and all, for choosing that thorny path in exchange for that special life. He says that it is not a thorny road, but a great opportunity. Then we see what we'll call the spiritual form of the sword, which tells him to prepare to train because he must see his current level to train him properly. So without hesitation, he goes to train. Once he was right on his doorstep, Elst asks him why he wakes up so early, what he ignores because he's worried about the flamboyant and flashy shape of the sword. Elst understands that this would be a big problem for his training, because he will not know what excuse use for having a sword on his room, so it decides to place a mark on him, on his wrist. The sword would be the only one who could see it, and now he would be able to invoke the sword whenever he wishes to. Changing the scene, we see our protagonist as having an intensive training. He realizes he feels different while he trains. He used to do the same movements before, thousands of times, but now the force would flow into his hands stronger due to the fact that someone trusted him. Then else corrects him and puts him to run, practicing different training techniques. Our very exhausted star thinks that, in order to become strong, he will give everything of himself. Later we see he has fallen asleep in the academy but is awakened by Else that knows that he can't miss those classes because of how important they are. Then Else tells him that it already knows how to start his training, explaining that for an excellent handling of the sword it is essential to strengthen the eyes, guts and strength, and that the order of the list was important so they would go from the view, which is the most important thing, then the guts and finally the strength. The very surprised protagonist thinks he had never heard of an eye workout, and the sword tells him it'll show him how useless his eyes were. The training began. The sword started teaching with focus at his classes, in which Else tells him to use his teacher as a focus for 10 seconds, and after that it asks him questions. The protagonist answers perfectly the questions about his teacher, but when the sword asks him about what was on the board, he can't remember anything, even if he was in the same field of vision. Else explains that his brain doesn't consider those things important and that the view was the sense that most scatter. Because even though we all have a field of vision of 220 degrees, the filter of unnecessary information of the brain only uses 120 degrees. He also explains how to make his field of vision improve, and our protagonist begins with his training that seemed exaggeratedly easy. While he's training, Julia sees him and wonders why he has that strange look on his face. After that, our protagonist leaves his class with his eyes exhausted from all the training he is receiving in the middle of class. Else thinks that means he's doing completely well, and the fatigue of his eyes is only because they are dry, and the headache he has is normal due to the release of everything that had been frozen for so long. On his way home, he continues to be trained with different things, so when he finally gets home his eyes are completely irritated. After a talk with Else, this one tells him it would teach him the aura after he leaves the academy, since someone like him so baseless learning aura would raise unnecessary suspicions. So he now would have to focus on vision training to beat Leon. The protagonist, very excited, accepts. Also, Else tells him that if he gets used to his training he will end up getting bored, so to avoid that, every time he answers Else's questions in the wrong way he will receive a punishment, giving a bad feeling to our protagonist about that aforementioned punishment. He tells him that he does it only to help him to improve because, although he has a strong will, he needs someone to push him even more. The protagonist agrees and receives a strong shock from Else. It tells him that this time there's been a miscalculation and that should be less painful, but that the more he was wrong, the more intensity will increase, to what the protagonist wonders if that was a demoniac sword or what. The scene changes and now our protagonist is having a hard training in his endurance, strength and sight. After finishing he thinks he can finally go home, but then Leon calls him. He haven't seen him since his meeting with Julia. He asks him to have a conversation of around 10 minutes, and after the talk, he says he wants to have a last confrontation with real swords and without ore, and that if our protagonist loses, he will become the vassal of Leon, and if Leon loses, he could ask for anything ever since it wouldn't ruin Leon's honor or his family's. Then he says that whenever the protagonist was ready, he should tell him with 3 days in advance so he could prepare everything for the battle. Then we see that inside the sword the spirit of the King Rodrigo says that soon it'll be the first confrontation of our protagonist, who was chosen at the whim of Else, and Leon, who plans to take the imperial throne. We see our protagonist is very nervous, what annoys Else, and asks why, after being so sure responding to Leon, is so anxious now. But our protagonist tells him that it is not fear for Leon but, on the contrary, he's nervous to know if he has really become strong or not. Else tells him that although he hasn't realized it, he has actually become very strong, so he shouldn't worry. We're now at the fitness test and Else asks where Leon, and he answers that he's on the first spot. Else says that this showed that he has trained more than most of the people, but still he haven't trained much more than our protagonist. The test is about giving 2 laps to the field. 1 lap is equivalent to 400 meters, and Leon managed to break the record in the last test with a time of 1 minute and 20 seconds, and our protagonist did it with 1 minute and 50 seconds. Else tells him that this difference is not much, that he doesn't have to worry about it. What motivating the protagonist? He prepares to start the race and leaves at full speed, finishing the test with a time of 1 minute and 29 seconds, leaving everyone surprised including Leon, so they ask the protagonist if he has awakened the aura. They do a test and realize that he hasn't done it yet, so he surprised everyone with such incredible physique. The protagonist doesn't understand how it was that he acquired so much strength, and Else explains that with the shocks he has been receiving he has developed his nervous system, allowing him to develop his strength to the limit. He's very surprised to learn that it was thanks to all the shocks he had received he has become so strong. Else didn't tell him anything about it because it had not seen the shocks as a punishment, and that it has only been doing what it should as a sacred sword. The irritated protagonist wonders if Else is actually an evil sword instead of a sacred sword, questioning whether King Rodrigo was a hero or a villain because he was the one who managed to capture the spirit of Else. Then we see that Leon finished the test, breaking their previous record and leaving the protagonist on the second place. This annoyed the students for knocking them out of their posts, being just commoner, since the first 5 places are normally taken by the children of the nobles. The protagonist doesn't pay much attention to that, because he knows that the gap between him and Leon has been closed enormously, making him sure to win against him. Elst asks him if he doesn't know where he can find someone to fight around since he needs real experience, but the protagonist tells him that it is almost impossible because that's not a slum where there are thugs. Later at school, when he was walking, he runs into 3 nobles who tried to accuse him of cheating in the test and stealing their places. Elst thinks that even if 300 years pass, the nobles will always be as rough as always. The protagonist tells them that if they have any problems with the ranking, then they should go to the teacher, making them upset. He knows they had only come to uproot the weed that is bothering them at the root. One of his group of nobles, which was the son of a countess, appears and offers the protagonist to listen at him, and the protagonist accesses to do it and ends up being challenged under the supervision of an instructor. He knows they're only trying to take advantage of it, since they know that our protagonist can't use the aura, but he can't reject them because they will seek to hurt him in another way, so it was best to go along with their plan. He ends up accepting with the conditions that the supervisor must be Helmut and that they would confront him 1 per day, and that if he wins, they won't ever again raise suspicions of his abilities. The guy thinks about it and ends up accepting it, thinking he'll beat him until he loses his conscience. Later on, the protagonist asks Elst if he'll be able to defeat them without aura, and the sword comes up with an idea, which is to gossip his first opponent, making appear his window of status. Once it appears showed that the son of the countess's abilities were actually below than the protagonist, because even though as the son of the countess he probably has taken a lot of elixirs to improve his strength. But if he doesn't know how to direct them, these elixirs are nothing more than a healthy meal. Our protagonist, instead, managed to overcome that strength barrier with the help of Elst and workouts that he has done with all his effort, having enough strength to finish off that group of bullies. So the very determined protagonist no longer thinks to be under anyone, and on the contrary, he thinks to aim for the top, in order to show his place to those boys who only try to humiliate him. Moments later, the day of the first confrontation arrived, and outside the training room, where the duel will be, the protagonist is approached by the instructor Helmut, who was worried about him and wanted to stop him. But seeing how decided he was, he could only ask him to beat up that group of idiots, to what the protagonist, with a mischievous, smiles. We see that in the first duel, the noble against who he will fight is full of arrogance, saying to the protagonist who he think he is make him wait. After that, they decide what the rewards of that duel will be. Our Leon only asks them to stop bothering him, and the noble says that he would have to confess that he cheated in the previous test to be in second place. Then, the instructor gives the signal to begin the fight, which would be observed Leon and Julia. They start attacking, and when the protagonist is about to receive the blow, he wonders why it is so slow. With incredible speed, he leaves his opponent totally defeated with only 1 punch, leaving as much as the teacher, his friends, and the group of bullies with their mouths open. His opponent, struggling with pain, stands up while asking the protagonist for a second fight, saying that only by 1 blow he can't win and that the fight isn't over. The professor doesn't want them to continue the fight, since the defeat was fatal. But our protagonist decides to give him a second chance, since before he had gave him only 1 blow for mercy. Elst tells him to give him more than 1 hit to take advantage of his optical technique and to take it as a practice, and wanting to punch that guy even more, agrees. The battle begins again and the noble launches to attack the protagonist, but he can see his movements clearly. Elst tells him that he has understood that if he can see the origin, he can already know what will happen next. So he stops the attack, but as the other guy is using aura, he can cut his sword easily because with the aura he has become stronger. But even so, the protagonist could still see his openings, so he attacks him at one of his legs, making him move away. And without any hope for the noble, the protagonist approaches him quickly, giving him multiple blows and making him end up accepting his defeat. And so our star ends up being the winner of that duel. His colleagues are very happy with his victory, make his opponents even more upset. In the corridors, the rumors of the 2 duels of the protagonist are spread, and they talk about how he sent 2 nobles to the infirmary, so now only the Elmost remains. On the day of the battle with Elmost, he was waiting for the protagonist with a commanding aura that the protagonist doesn't seem to care about, but still takes into account that this one has stronger skills, so he should not underestimate it. Most arrogantly says that he didn't think that in reality the protagonist would make it to the 3rd match, but this one defends himself, saying that he already knew he would defeat them, making his opponent upset. Leon knows that, by the strength of his opponent, he can't face him head-on because of his wooden sword. At the beginning of the combat, the protagonist is quickly surprised to see that he was attacked without thinking with sword energy. The protagonist knows that Elmost's attack speeds are much faster than his because, even if he was an idiot, he's still a nobleman who all his life has had a much better quality training. Elmost tries to recruit him, trying to forget everything from the past, but he ignores him and launches the attack, wounding Elmost in the face and making him upset. The noble arrogantly offends the teachings that our protagonist has had, annoying Elst that was his teacher, so it asks the protagonist if this guy was able to offend his teachings, making our protagonist cling to his mood. Elst tells the protagonist that if he can see Elmost smile with his teeth still intact after that duel, he will suffer a strong punishment from him. The protagonist quickly thinks to pull out all the teeth he can and his aura changes completely. He quickly attacks Elmos, causing him to back away and surprising everyone who's watching the combat. The protagonist and Elmos are almost on par, but he knows that if he focuses his eyes he can compensate for his inferiority. They continue their fight, blow after blow, and the professor wonders how our protagonist is able to handle the noble in this way. Elmos decides to draw his trump card, making the protagonist activate his optical technique to the maximum in order to know what attack he will use. Elmos launches to stab Leon with a strong murderous intention, but he manages to dodge it, but again is attacked in a way he wouldn't be able to dodge that blow and could break his ribs, leaving him crippled. Seeing that he was going to lose, the protagonist refuses to give up, and with all his power decides to force himself to avoid that blow, and somehow, his legs act by reflex with great force, making him jump through the air and above his opponent's attack. Elmos, without understanding anything, is hit on his shoulder and ends up with only one arm in that duel and deeply sore, but still he decides to attack and break the sword of the protagonist with his aura, to leave him without a weapon and win. But when he went to attack the protagonist he disarms him with a strong blow and blows his jaw, making him lose several of his teeth. Everyone in the room is excited by such a victory and the protagonist ends up being the winner. Else praises the protagonist and explains that the reflex of his legs is called the ability to accelerate, which only high-ranking swordsmen use to move at high speeds. It was usually learned when they already using the aura because if it is used without it, for the deep force that is required, they could lose their life. So the protagonist ends up having the consequences for using that ability without the aura and suffers a deep pain in his thighs. Later in the corridors of the academy there were rumors about the protagonist having elixirs from renowned families, and that he has been hiding his identity, and was actually a secret weapon of the palace. All those rumors were spread by the three nobles who were beaten, in order to discredit the protagonist and to try not to look so bad. Later, we see the protagonist runs into with Julia in the hallway, so they decide to sit on a bench. After chatting she asks him why is he avoiding her and that she doesn't understand how, out of the blue, he's having duels, day after day, and such incredible victories. She also tells him that he's worrying her and Leon a lot. The protagonist is suspended in his thoughts about Julia and how it's been so long since the last time they have such a comfortable and open conversation. He also thinks that, since he's been having feelings for her, he has felt very jealous to see her getting close to Leon. Those jealous makes him plunged into his sense of inferiority, hating the world because it doesn't reward him for his hard work, and also blaming himself for it. Then Julia tells him that everyone in the hallways talks about him and there were rumors that he got a magic sword, and when she turns she sees our protagonist immersed in tears. Realizing how she tries to comfort him, saying that he doesn't have to worry about those rumors since they are just that, but he says it has nothing to do with it, leaving Julia confused. The protagonist thinks that it was all thanks to the Elst, who speaks crudely and has a bad personality, that pulled him out of a bottomless pit, and meanwhile, inside the Sword King Roderick's alter ego wonders why he's leveling up so quickly. The protagonist thinks that although a hero saves the world, he was saved by Elst, and that is precisely because of it that he will become a hero just like the original owner of that sword, King Roderick, exceeding Elst's expectations. Roderick wonders how he has leveled up so quickly just by having a conversation with Julia, to which he concludes he wouldn't understand anyway because he's been perfect from birth, and that it didn't matter what was the reason he leveled up, that he still looked worthy of being educated by him. What makes the protagonist cling to those words? Before leaving, Julia asks the protagonist to talk to Leon since he doesn't talk to anyone but her and that he considers him a friend, and the protagonist says he will try it. But once on his bed he thinks he should apologize to her because he doesn't think he can be friends with Leon. Later, at Leon's house, we see he's thinking about our protagonist and everything he's seen lately. The scene quickly changes and we see the protagonist, while training, thinks about how to defeat Leon, since he saw the window of Leon's status and now knows that he's a terribly powerful opponent, even being stronger than the instructor Helmut and possessing a strength that someone of 30 years old could have, being only 17. Elst, trying to comfort him, tells him that he'll advise him as best as he can to help him on that fight, and the protagonist asks what it plans to do if he loses to Leon, since he thinks Elst will change him for the noble, but the sword denies to answer, saying that this wasn't a proof for him. The protagonist says that it is a proof, a very difficult one, but Elst says that he says he'll explain everything after the duel, so the protagonist kept training. Later, at a rainy night on Leon's house, a letter from the protagonist arrived, saying he was ready to fight, and Leon's servant is happy to hear the combat would finally happen. And Leon asks him for a favor we don't get to hear, but we do see that Leon has decided to win so he can make the protagonist his soldier. The scene changes and at that rainy night we see the protagonist walks to the room where he'll fight against Leon, and the instructor Helmut comments to him that there's no one else watching the battle except for one person, for Leon's request. The protagonist deduced that person must be Julia. Elst tells him that Leon would probably try to defeat him and humiliate him in front of Julia so she could be his wife, showing their clear difference to everyone, because it was a commune thing between commoners and kings to fight for a woman. But the truth is that Leon only thinks about having the protagonist at his side because of his strengths. But the protagonist is upset because he thinks Leon wants to clarify who governs and who is governed to have Julia for him, acting just like any noble, trying to control the relationships and emotions of the people. Terribly upset, he thinks that if that's how nobles acted, he would destroy him. Seeing this mood, Elst realizes it was better not to say any of that. But it was now too late because the protagonist was already getting into the battle room. The protagonist asks who the watcher is, but they tell him the person can't be seen by none of them, so they won't get distracted. He's ready to start the fight, but before they begin, Leon takes a pill to take his aura out, so he couldn't use it on the combat. They both are on their positions now, deeply focused. Helmut gives the sing and the combat begins, so they quickly start crushing their swords, multiple times. The protagonist knows he won't resist his punches so directly because of the clearly difference of their strength, and is surprised for the Leon's constant attacks, what makes him notice the difference between him and almost his last opponent. Even though the protagonist is using his focus technique, he can barely see Leon's figure in front of his eyes, but relaxing, they start having multiple swords crashes again. The instructor and the servant are in shock because this doesn't feel like a student's combat, but one of real soldiers, and even more than that, they know both of them are monsters. The servant thinks he didn't think the protagonist could reach Leon's level since he was a genius. On the battle, Leon starts throwing a double attack, but the protagonist manages to counterattack, and receiving them, Leon realizes their damages. He lost some hair and the protagonist had a cut on his chest. He starts analyzing the situation and realizes the protagonist is willing to win with resistance, and the protagonist notices he's been discovered. Front to front, Leon plans to end with the fight spirit of the protagonist in order to win, so decides to use some great movements. His servant wonders if he'll use the Imperial technique, which functions the next way. It uses muscles and blood to break the user's limit. But it wouldn't be the full technique since he wasn't using his aura, but only with it would be enough. The protagonist, on the other hand, activates his focus technique to the maximum when he's attacked by Leon, who wonders if the protagonist would manage to dodge him, and barely did it, ending up with his arm very hurt. He wonders how Leon could do that and if he's maybe using his aura. Elst, out of the blue, scares the protagonist, saying it wasn't aura, and while he tries to explain how he attacked him, he's attacked again by Leon, who's annoyed because the protagonist seems very distracted on this combat. Because Elst distracted him, the protagonist ends up, with this attack, with a serious injury on his face. But anyway, he stands up again, what surprises the servant seeing how quickly his mood changed. The protagonist knows he can't trust his ability of accelerations because that one has very serious consequences, so he must know trust on his own strength and will. Leon is surprised seeing he's looking bigger than him, and this increases his wishes of making him his soldier, so he decides to use his technique again, breaking his limits, what surprises his servant and Elst. They start throwing attacks with all they, and we see the protagonist ends up with Leon's sword, and this one can't believe what just happened. Then, the protagonist says to Leon that the difference between them is that he knows the limit of his sword, and that he, born with talent, doesn't know his. And like that, the protagonist claims his victory. The servant congrats the protagonist for his victory, and Elst asks what Leon wanted if he won. Leon asks him, honorably, what he wants for his victory, but the protagonist says that he haven't actually think about it and that he will tell him later, and with a smile on his face, Leon access to that. The protagonist is very hurt and exhausted because he forced himself too much since Leon was a very strong opponent. But suddenly Julia heals his arm and then, crying, she says she doesn't understand any of them, but that thanks to the saint he won, since he has become very strong. Julia asks him if he's going to leave the academy, and he asks her how she knows. She says she knows him like the palm of her own hand, that he's always been capable of accomplishing things normal people could not, because of his efforts, and also mentions how it took him a little bit more to win against Leon. Both of them laugh, and the protagonist tells her to go punch Leon, who's probably very depressed, and that a woman's punch that he always listened at would make his defeat a way of growing on the future, leaving him on her hands. While he's leaving, Julia screams at him and asks him what he'll do once he leaves the academy, and he only says that for now, that will be a secret, leaving Julia thinking. The protagonist has always wanted to become a person who wouldn't lose against his friends, but sadly, he couldn't always fight against the social status or the talents. He lost his way in front of two important persons because he felt he wasn't good enough. But once he knew Elst, he could free himself of that inferiority feeling that was on the deep of his heart, what allowed him to escape from his friend's shadows. But now, he would become a hero and the most special person of this world, that with all of his efforts and dedication. Elst tells him that is because of that strong mentality that he chose him, and that Leon was the one who would be chosen, the son of the imperial family. The sword will restore the corrupt emperor, and Leon was designated as the hero 150 years ago. To this, the protagonist says Leon actually looks like the perfect hero and asks what will be his proof, and Elst answers that he already passed it. There wasn't any rule that says the hero has to be chosen by any prophecy, and that anyone who fight for his future with strength could also make himself a hero. He asks him if he feels guilty for stealing the opportunity to become a hero from his friend, but he answers he doesn't. Without doubting, Leon have everything, compared to him. He's been born with gold on his mouth, and he was chosen by Elst, so it wasn't his fault. At the next day, our protagonist requests to leave the academy. What made the instructor sad? He will become an adventurer. Before he leaves, the protagonist was proud because his actions made a lot of commoners start to train hard to leave the academy and look for adventures. The story continues with Leon and Elsid, who have set out on their journey to discover new horizons. Half a month later, our hero emerges from a forest with a smile on his face, having overcome the difficulties that besieged him within. As he gazes at the horizon, he sees the city of Blaine and rejoices at the thought of sleeping in a fresh bed again. Elsid reminds him that he should be grateful, as that forest had become his training ground. With a hypocritical response, our protagonist tells him that they should better head to Blaine, as he feels sad to have to say goodbye to the forest. We are told that half a month ago, our protagonist and Elsid ventured into the forest, as it was the path to the city of Blaine. And in that moment, Leon experienced for the first time the beauty and difficulties of camping in the wild. The goblins constantly attacked him, and due to these adverse conditions, Elsid allowed him to wield the sacred sword. With the use of this sacred weapon, Leon improved his sword handling skill, successfully killing goblins with a technique that Elsid had taught him. Thus, Leon ended up strengthening himself more than he was before entering the forest. With that in mind, Leon desired to kill more monsters in the future. However, Elsid reminded him that although he was motivated, he was still an empty vessel, as he would never become stronger if he did not prepare his foundations to start strengthening himself through monster hunting. Changing scenes in the city of Blaine, our protagonist arrives at the gate, successfully entering because they have a lot of trust in the identification from the academy. Elsid comments that there are many thugs in that city, causing the protagonist to become agitated and shout loudly, making everyone hear. But Elsid explains that for the past 300 years, there have been medium-sized cities where there were always many thugs, making it unsafe. Leon thinks that he is still very lacking in experience and decides to go look for the guild to register as an adventurer. Being a mercenary would also be okay, but the difference between these two is that, unlike mercenaries, adventurers are much more free. Additionally, he has no intentions of getting involved in the fight between nobles. Therefore, it would be much better to focus on subjugating monsters. It should be taken into account that Elsid still has many seals due to descending 1 year earlier than expected. If it weren't for this, its wielder would possess an almost immortal body due to the sword's astounding recovery speed, as well as enormous strength with which it could cause critical damage to demonic beings, obtaining as a bonus becoming multiple times stronger along with its aura and sacred energy, which the protagonist knows that in order to unleash all the power of the sword, he needs to strengthen himself beyond normal. Changing scenes, in the guild our protagonist registers and is told that he will start with rank D, thus being able to take on missions and not just any tasks. To which they tell him that easily in that way he will be able to rise to rank C. Since for rank B he needs to be able to use weapon aura, which the protagonist still hasn't achieved. Since that ability is where someone can use their aura outside of their body and use it as a weapon, achieving even splitting rocks and cutting steel, which is considered superhuman, which makes the protagonist wonder how strong a rank ORS is. After finishing the registration, the protagonist must complete a free mission to be fully accepted as an adventurer. In another scene, the protagonist was killing countless rats in the sewers and taking advantage to train what would be attacking more than one target with the sacred sword, when suddenly a slightly different rat appears, as this is an evolved species having lived for a long time or absorbing many resources, which gave it some kind of special power. The longer the horn, the more dangerous the ability is. When the rat man attacks our protagonist, he manages to evade his special attack using the sacred sword, which concentrates on eliminating the darkness of the world. In this way, he completes the mission and obtains the horn of the rat man. Later, at the guild, Leon arrives with a sack full of rat tails, surprising the guild girl Rise, as the weight of the sack means that he has killed 230 rats and is even more surprised to see 4 horns of rat men. After changing all of this, he was given a lot of coins, as that mission was very difficult and no one had killed so many on their first time. Although it was supposed to be free, he ended up earning quite a bit. In a few words, Rise falls for the protagonist for the face he makes when he tells her that he is amazing, and gave him his rank D adventurer's insignia, which makes the protagonist happy to become an adventurer and not just a student of the academy. Later, when leaving the guild, Elsid tells him that apparently the receptionist Rise mistook him for a sacred knight, because of the type of missions she gave him and how easy she made them. Since hundreds of years ago, the sacred knights before being named went around the world helping people while hiding their identity. But Elsid also tells him that he will probably faint when he finds out that Leon is a hero for having the magical sword, even becoming a legend in the guild for being the one who attended him, which makes the protagonist think that he is actually just training but in the process ends up helping people, and that when he reaches rank B, he will leave the city of Blaine. Elsid tells the protagonist that he will advance his training and in 100 days they will be able to leave. He also mentions that he does not want a hero to go around killing sewer rats. He also says that at least the protagonist must become strong enough to defeat a dragon. With the vision and movement skills he has learned, he will be able to kill enough monsters and become stronger with experience. Additionally, the monsters he kills will give power to his sword, It is something that anyone could do, absorbing the power of monsters, but high-ranking officials in the past hid this fact so that only they could do it and therefore become stronger. But after they died, these techniques were lost, so only Elsid knows how to do it. And in that way, by killing stronger and stronger monsters, he will be able to easily kill dragons. Then he will go to the Titan Mountains, a place where even dragons dare not go. But it will be a place of great help to the protagonist. The protagonist is afraid of everything Elsid tells him. But he tells him that his body was left there and that he does not remember much about what happened. But that will be his goal in that half year and that he should simply trust him. Changing the scene. When the protagonist arrives at the guild, they call him by the nickname Cat because he has been killing ratmen every day. When he delivers the tales he has collected, Rise tells him that they are less than usual, but he thinks that it is because when they see him, they try to run away as fast as they can because they know they will be killed. Later, Rise presents the protagonist with some missions that she had been saving for him, and the protagonist selects one mission that nobody had done before due to its difficulty. The mission is the subjugation of rock slimes. Changing scenes. When the protagonist arrives at the site, he is greeted by the guards. The knight who had ordered that mission then arrives and gives him all the instructions, and without further ado, the protagonist sets off towards where the slimes are. As he walks a bit, he realizes that there are 3 of them in a hallway, but as he tries to take a closer look, he is attacked by a rock, which he barely manages to evade. However, when he turns around again, he already has a slime in front of him. But after trying to attack it, he is surprised to see that his sword has bounced back. This is because there are countless rock fragments protecting the slime's core, which is, so to say, its heart. Then, he manages to evade multiple attacks from the slimes, which were pushing him back. But he manages to see that when they attack, their core becomes unprotected, and he starts using this to eliminate them all. But after killing a few of them, he almost slips, but fortunately, he manages to evade and kill the last slime. After finishing, Elsid explains to him that what just happened is that he reached level 2 in footwork, which its basic principle is to find balance on flat ground and reduce both sound and vibration, even if there are other things on the ground, whether it's ice or boiling steel. Later, Elsid tells him that he should start receiving blows in order to try only avoiding critical damage as a training method, in case one day he doesn't have an escape and must only try to minimize the damage. After hearing this, the protagonist gets angry and tells him that why doesn't he just ask him to die. But Elsid, at the same time, tells him that it's for his own good, as if he trains easily in the future it will be hell for him. And without more, they go to kill the slimes. Changing scene. The Guardian is surprised to see that the protagonist has been killing slimes for 3 weeks. When the protagonist arrives from the caves, he says that he has finished killing all the slimes near that guard post. Later, while talking with Elsid, he comments that after gathering all the energy of the slimes, he managed to take the first step to learn the aura. Later, when he arrives home, he finds himself in his room with Elsid, who asks him if he's ready, to which he responds that of course. He explains that in the process of the aura baptism, which usually those who form that baptism usually die from the recoil, being few the lucky ones, but that with the power of the sword he will be able to heal himself almost at the same time that his circulatory system is being destroyed, but even if nothing happens to him, he will have to endure terrible pain. And in case he faints, the baptism will be a failure, so it will depend on his willpower to endure the pain. After Elsid begins the baptism, Leon manages to see multiple swords in the air and is then pierced by one of them, experiencing a terrible pain. However, he receives multiple swords. Elsid is surprised by Leon's great ability to endure pain. He also realizes that as Leon wakes up his aura, he can now sense many more presences that were hidden in Blaine. The protagonist is surprised to feel the flow throughout his body, but Elsid tells him that he can simply use the baptism to unblock his major vein, but still must train his smaller veins, which makes the protagonist understand and think that even though they still possess a small power and have a long way to go, he manages to feel the energy that flows and covers his body, like nerves but outside of his body. After the baptism, Elsid explains to Leon that there are 5 attributes of aura: water, fire, metal, wood, and earth. These attributes are normally possessed by people, but Elsid does not possess any of them. This makes Leon wonder what Elsid's attribute is, but Elsid tells him that he possesses the sun attribute, which is a very rare attribute and the same one that King Rodrigo possessed. This attribute represents light and heat, the strongest attribute that could exist, and in short, it is the brightness. This leaves Leon very impressed and also makes him very happy to have the same attribute as the legendary hero, Roderick. Then, Elsid proceeds to show him his status window, showing him that he has already unlocked the aura and is now a level 3 user, because before learning this, he was able to learn the sense of aura, automatically surpassing levels 1 and 2. And so, Elsid will begin to teach him fencing, which he lacks. The protagonist is very happy and says that he will finally learn the fencing of the great hero Roderick, asking Elsid to start training immediately. Elsid accepts his request but also reminds him that in that city, his enemies lie. This leaves the protagonist very confused. Elcid explains to the protagonist that there are arch-enemies of the hero, people who manipulate beings from other worlds in order to try and defeat the hero, while committing all sorts of atrocities. One such group is called Malice. This makes the protagonist determined to become even stronger. However, Elcid tells him that he does not currently have enough strength and that it will take at least 2 months for these enemies to come out into the open and act. Because he is not strong enough yet, he must find a way to attack them somehow. In a different scene, the protagonist speaks with Rise, who has been worried about him for not showing up for several days, and who is also surprised to see that he senses something different about the protagonist and congratulates him. She then gives him his C rank badge. The protagonist is surprised to see that he did not have to take any kind of test in order to pass this rank. Rise tells him that due to his performance and the missions he has been undertaking, he received high recommendations from the guard who had requested the mission to defeat the slimes. Without hesitation, the protagonist asks Rise for C-rank missions with the purpose of finding any suspicious actions that will lead him to Malice. As he looks for these missions, Rise watches him in surprise, thinking that he started looking for missions immediately after being promoted, thinking that Sacred Knights are amazing. The protagonist, not finding anything related to militia in those missions, tells Rise to look for something related to the suburbs. This leaves Rise surprised, as the suburbs are where all kinds of criminals are found and it is a lawless area. Rise tells him that she doubts there are missions related to that area, as these missions are usually for mercenaries. The protagonist thinks that at this stage he can no longer become a mercenary, and if he simply went to that area without reason, he would start to attract attention. Suddenly, Rise shows him a mission in which he must subdue some living armors in an abandoned mansion. The living armors are ornamental armors that were abandoned in those mansions and turned into living armors. And he ends up accepting the mission, thinking that with his sword he will not have problems against the armors. He says goodbye to Rise and leaves, thanking her. But before leaving, he asks Rise where he can find the church. She, terrified, gives him the direction, but as a sacred knight when he is in penance, he cannot ask for help from the church unless there is a strong enemy that the church allows to punish. And after the protagonist left, she thinks that she must warn the Association of Adventurers about there is a strong enemy, since a sacred knight is looking for the help of the church. But what the protagonist really wanted was to call their attention so that they are alert in case he makes a report, but he wants to keep that as his ace in the hole. Changing scenes, Leon is standing in front of the mansion. He proceeds to enter the area and at the same time, one of the armors perceives his presence. As Leon enters through the door, he finds himself face to face with one of the armors, which was armed with a halberd, giving it an advantage in terms of distance. But still, the protagonist uses Excel to get closer to it and ends up cutting it into several pieces. As he realizes that many more armors were coming, he uses the holy sword as a torch to light up the room, but he is surprised to see that it does not cause a scandal, but rather a refreshing light. Meanwhile, the armors were affected by this light, so they decide to attack Leon together, but he can easily counterattack because they are just armors and not people. In the middle of the battle, Elcid tells him that these are not common armors and asks him to use his vision to see them well. When using his vision, he is surprised to see that they are evil spirits, which are born from a restless spirit living inside an armor while growing with a deep hatred towards the living. But these can be easily killed with the power of the protagonist's sword and his aura because of his attribute, which is not very different from holy power. But as he sees that there are many, he decides to leave and start killing them one by one. But Elcid tells him that that number is not normal, because for there to be so many people have to be dying in that city, which makes the protagonist angry and decides to put aside coming back later, and proceeds to eliminate many of them with ease. At dawn, he was already surrounded by a pile of armor cut into pieces, thinking he had finished with many of them. To which he tells Elcid that he was getting in the middle of all the armor to be surrounded intentionally because he wants to develop his intuition even more. Because he must become stronger in order to fight in the lower districts, because in that place there are many traps with bad intentions that he will not be able to discover only using his vision. Changing scenes, in another part of the lower districts. A kid was crying, but when he opened his eyes, he automatically shut up out of terror at the man in front of him, which was Khan, the boss of the most powerful gang in Blaine. Later, inside Khan's room, his subordinates were giving him reports about the protagonist's mansion and that in the sewers of districts 23 and 25 they found a lot of blood, organs, and other things, thus assuming that at least that day 30 people had died, which makes Khan angry, and orders them to make a report so that the church or the guild take actions. Because otherwise, if he decides to ally in the slightest way with those who commit such atrocities, they will be hunted to the end of the continent by the holy knights. They tell him about the protagonist and that he has been cleaning up the tasks that others have declined, thus obtaining the nickname the Cat. Khan thinks that the protagonist is an interesting person and thinks that he would have a use for him. Changing the scene, the protagonist, who was already exhausted from fencing training, manages to see the great results he has had in his state window, seeing that he is a level 5 aura user and with his intermediate level swordsmanship. But when he complains to Elcid that he does not have the sword skill of King Roderick, Elcid tells him that it is obvious that he has not learned a skill that he cannot even master the first technique. The skill of King Roderick is known as Chariot Claw, a skill that he invented in his early days, which the protagonist thinks he should at least learn the first technique to have it as an ace up his sleeve, since anyone below the master rank would be killed or severely injured if they received it. Then Elcid tells Leon that they have visitors, and when he looks out the window, he realizes that they are the subjects of Khan, who apparently have no bad intentions. When they come down, they ask him if he is the broom, to which the protagonist nods, and they tell him that his guild leader is summoning him. And without hesitation, he asks them to guide him to the boss, leaving them surprised that he accepted the invitation without batting an eye. But what the protagonist plans is to enter the heart of the slums through the boss, since he knew that this was one of the pillars of the slums. Upon arriving, he realizes a wall full of blood, which apparently was not cleaned to scare people. When out of nowhere Khan arrives behind him, asking him if he is the broom. Without hesitation, the protagonist draws his sword and launches an attack on Khan due to the surprise. But with great ease, Khan manages to block the attack and then delivers a strong blow towards Leon, who in his mind thought he was about to be killed. But surprisingly, Khan stopped his blow just before it hit, leaving the protagonist completely surprised that he couldn't even avoid the blow. While he was saying that he already knew almost everything about his background, thinking that the protagonist, according to his background, only wanted to not lower his head in front of the nobles, and that everything he had done, such as hitting the nobles and becoming an adventurer who completed missions that no one else did, he was looking for fame. But the protagonist thinks that this guy can't be more wrong because he can't, to which he thinks that if he thinks that way, he won't correct him. Instead, he will use it to his advantage.